Good morning. Scripture reading taken for today is from the book of Exodus, chapter 2, verses 1 to 4, the birth of Moses. Now a man from the house of the Lord, Levi, went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. When she couldn't hide him no longer, she took him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds in the riverbank. And the sister stood at a distance to know what would be done with him.
Morning to all. For over 3,000 years, the narrative of the book of Exodus has been recounted by parents to their children. But the beautiful thing about it is that it's not just a story for children. Anybody of all ages, from the very young to the very old, can learn lessons from it. And it says a lot to the truth of this book that it applies to all people in all eras. And the book of Exodus is a redemption story. And that's how I want to look at it this morning. In order to understand Christ, we have to understand the book of Exodus. Because in the book of Exodus, we see how God is going to save his people and ultimately how he's going to save the world. But it's not just a tribal history of the descendants of Israel or Jacob. It applies to all of us even now, even today. On the road to Emmaus, we see some disciples of Jesus. They're downcast. This is after the death, the crucifixion of Jesus. They're heartbroken because they had really believed that he was the Messiah. And he had disappointed them by being killed, by being cruelly executed. But Jesus talks to these people before they realize who he is, and he begins with Moses. And that's what we're going to look at this morning. And keep this in mind. We have in the book of Genesis, earlier than Exodus, a promise made by God, firstly to Abraham, and then his son Isaac, and then repeated to Jacob, who would be renamed as Israel, that they would bless the entire world, and they would have enough descendants that it would look like you couldn't count them all. More grains, more of them than grains on the seashore. But we see in the book of Exodus, starting in the beginning, is the threat to this promise. We see in verse 8, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, Joseph was a son of Jacob or Israel, and he'd led his brothers into Egypt, and they were able to live there, and they survived a famine. But this new king was going to be against them. And surprisingly enough, archaeology has proven the fact of this. Skeptics and people who did not believe the Bible, who wanted to actively attack it, in the 19th century said this never happened. But in the 1930s, there were a lot of excavations done in Tanis, and this is during the Tanis era. If you're familiar with the Raiders of the Lost Ark, there's an archaeological dig at Tanis. That is based on reality. But the remarkable discoveries there that prove the book of Exodus were forgotten because World War II came along and they were kind of swept aside. So we see that this Pharaoh, I guess here we're in the 17th dynasty, and the 15th and 16th was the Tanis era. He wants to oppress the children of Israel because he feels that they're growing too strong. There's too many of them. And he tells the midwives who are delivering these children, if it's a boy, Israelite, just let them die. Do not let them survive. So here we see some form of eugenics, or later I suppose people would say it's like a Holocaust or genocide. But the midwives here follow the principle that we must obey God rather than man. And so they don't go along with Pharaoh, and they delay, or they tell the other midwives, delay your arrival if a woman is giving birth. And so if they give birth to a boy, they're not there to fulfill Pharaoh's evil decree. And Pharaoh gets very upset by this, And so he issues this blanket command to all the people in Egypt. If your neighbors, those Israelites, have a boy, throw him in the Nile River and let him drown. So he's involving, in his own wicked way, the whole nation of Egypt. And he's bringing the wrath of God upon all of Egypt for decreeing, let's take these Jewish or these Israelite kids, boys, and throw them into the river so that they will drown. Well, how does this apply to Christ? Well, in Matthew 2, we see something very similar occurring, which may or may not have come to your mind. Matthew 2, we have the birth of Jesus. Just as we're looking right now at the birth of Moses, now we're looking at the birth of Jesus. And I want to start reading in verse 13. Now, after they had left, these being the Magi, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up and took the child and his mother by night and went to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. So here we see a parallel. Jesus is born, and many of those young boys, the infants, were killed by an evil despotic ruler. Moses is also born when a despotic ruler is trying to kill young boys. But we see a second parallel here, because God tells Joseph, "You go to Egypt. Take the child and his mother and live in Egypt till I tell you to come back." Which raises the question, why wasn't he told, well, go to Sidon or go to Galilee? But Joseph was told to go to Egypt because here again, he's reenacting or he's connecting himself with Moses. "Out of Egypt I have called my son." So Jesus is reliving that in his own life. And this may seem fairly insignificant and unimportant to us, but to Jewish people who are looking for the Messiah in the first century, this was powerful proof, because they know that the Messiah, the Christ, is supposed to be like Moses. And they look at these, oh yes, Jesus is born. And those the boys in Jerusalem or in Bethlehem were endangered and they were killed, just like in Moses' time. And Jesus was living in Egypt and he came out of Egypt. So these were powerful truths in the first century. It may not mean so much to us, but it's important for us to keep in mind. In times of darkness, Herod is there, this despotic ruler, and he wasn't just cruel to those boys in Bethlehem. He was a cruel, all-round, general bad ruler. Or when you've got Pharaoh doing this, in times of darkness, God's promises may appear threatened, but God is faithful and he will maintain those promises. He will deliver. He's already working behind the scenes. There's another thing I want to point out is that the children of Israel are still multiplying in Egypt, even when Pharaoh is trying to get rid of them. They're still multiplying. And that is true with the new Israel, which is the church today. Even when the church is persecuted, it is multiplying. We see there's an early persecution after Saul of Tarsus gets angry and tries to kill Stephen and actually succeeds in killing Stephen. And there's a persecution breaks upon the church. And the church spreads and it begins to grow. Tertullian in North Africa said, the blood of martyrs, so when martyrs are killed for Christ, that is the seed of the church. Because other people are wondering, why are these good people being killed? What is it about them? So we see when persecution comes about, Christianity actually multiplies. I don't know too much about Soviet history, but I understand that when the Soviets came in under Stalin and they wanted their atheistic system, a lot of the Christians were thrown into gulags and they were sharing their faith. I know much more about modern Chinese history under Mao, and when many of the Christians were arrested and thrown into they were working in prison camps, they were working in slave factories. They continued to spread the word. And when there was a release, all of a sudden there's all these Christians in China. Where did they come from? So persecution, although Pharaoh's intent is to cut down on these Israelites, although other governments today might want to kill Christianity or stamp it out, it doesn't work that way because God is there working behind the scenes. Now let's take a look at this birth of the first Savior, of Moses. Now we see from the reading that he's born, and this young child is beautiful in his parents' eyesight, is taken to the river. And there are many, many pictures of the discovery of Moses, paintings that I could have shown. They're not accurate. This is just a random picture in Egypt, taken in Egypt by a traveler, a tourist, and he posted it. And we see the reeds here, the papyrus reeds, and somebody obviously has gone along and collected them and wrapped them up, and they're floating there. Who knows why? Probably somebody's going to come along later and get it. But I want us to understand this, because in the version that Dan read, it talks about the bulrushes, and sometimes we in North America have this idea, these bulrushes that we see beside the roads and in the little swamps and the ditches and whatnot. But actually, it's more properly, it's the papyrus. And so this is the type of area in which that little basket, or actually the word is the same as ark, as in Noah's ark. This little basket was there, and it's floating in the reeds. So the mother, as we understand, she's concerned. There's this decree that Israelite boys must be drowned, and she fears for her own child. She and her father, as she and the child's father, are fearing for it. And so she takes it down to the river. But it's not like she puts it in a basket and just lets it float down to the Mediterranean. Crocodiles could get her or whatever. She likely knew very well that wealthy, aristocratic Egyptian ladies would go to this portion of the river and they would bathe there. And we hear even in North America or England, I suppose, 120 years ago, people, if they had a child and they loved that child, but they couldn't raise it, they might see a car and they would put the child in the back seat of the car, because back then only rich people could have cars. Or we hear of them leaving it on the doorstep of some wealthy person or founding homes. So Moses is placed in this little ark-like, basket-like object that's going to float. And he's along the reeds here. And sure enough, along comes some aristocratic women. And I'm going to pick up on the narrative now in verse 5. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. So she sees something like this, I don't know, floating along there. Well, go get it, go get it. And they go get it. And there's a child inside, a lovely little child. In fact, it says in the earlier verses that Moses' parents were impressed when they saw this child. This is a precious, happy, lovely child. We can't have it destroyed. And Pharaoh's daughter agrees, and she wants to adopt it. And she knows right off the bat, you don't find babies floating around. It must be one of the Hebrew children. And sure enough, the sister is there, and Pharaoh's daughter talks to her. And the sister says to this daughter of Pharaoh, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter agrees. And Pharaoh's daughter was an intelligent woman, and she likely knew that this Hebrew child hiding in the reeds is going to go and get the baby's mother, the infant's mother. But that's okay with her. And so for a little while, Pharaoh gets to live with Moses gets to live with his own natural mother until he's old enough to go and to live into the palace of Pharaoh, where she raises him, and we know that she gives him all the benefits and the blessings that a prince of Egypt would receive. Now, Moses is a humble man. We know he's a humble man. And he's so humble that he doesn't even mention the name of his father and his mother. He just says that they were Levites. And this is important or significant to, again, the Jewish people in the first century, because the Levite tribe was the one that were the priestly class. They are the ones who mediated between God and man. And ultimately, Moses would mediate between God and the Israelite nation when they fled. Now, what is never told to us in Scripture, but what Josephus tells us, Jewish historian, is that after he was raised by Pharaoh's daughter, he commanded an army in the south of Egypt, which is not out of the question at all, because the Egyptian structure was very hierarchical and they had a lot of bureaucracy. And so when a prince is raised here, he's not just going to sit around the palace. He's going to be given some kind of administrative tasks. And so he likely was, in fact, commander of some army. And that would help him later in the preparation. We see that God is making for leading the children of Israel out of Egypt. They needed a leader who knew what he was doing, who was capable, who could make decisions. And all of this plays together. But we have to only suppose it, because Moses was such a humble man that he does not brag about himself. But reading between the lines, we can see that he was a very capable leader. Now, I want to point out something right now. Some of you may have heard the story about Sargon the Great. And if you haven't heard about it, you may hear about it. So I want to throw this out now. Story goes that Sargon the Great was an illegitimate son of a priestess, and she put him in a basket and floated him down the Euphrates River, and somebody drawing water picked him out and raised him up. But later on, he came back and he became great again. And critics again in the Bible have said, this story has been copied by the Jews. Well, the story about Sargon the Great, we don't even know that it is real. Sargon II developed it as a piece of propaganda in about between 720 and 700 BC. So the late 7th century BC, which is 800 years after Moses' story. But according to critics, they will say, well, the Jews, when they were in captivity, heard this story and they adapted it. But this type of story is not uncommon. We have so many stories like this. If you know your Greek mythology, you've got the story of Perseus, you've got Oedipus. In Persian history, you have Cyrus. Even today, we have the story of Snow White. Snow White is a princess, and her evil stepmother wants to have her killed, but she's abandoned. These type of stories are not uncommon. They're all after Moses, but there's a huge difference between the story of Moses that we've just read here and any of these other stories. Because in those other stories, it's a person who's born to greatness, and for a while their true identity is hidden, and then they come back and they become great rulers. But with Moses, we see somebody of humble origins, just a Levite man and a Levite woman, but he is adopted into greatness. But where it truly differs, and this is where we see again the connection between Moses and Jesus. Moses makes it to greatness, but he abandons that greatness to identify with his brothers, these poor people, these slaves. He identifies with them. He turns his back on all of that. He walks away from all the riches of Egypt, from the knowledge that he had, and he goes down to help those poor brothers and bring them out of slavery. What does the Christ do? He abandons his place in the heavenlies. He is beside God, he's with God, and he comes to earth to identify with us. We humans, as Brian pointed out earlier this morning, we're sinful, we're wicked. Why should God even care about us? But Christ identifies with us, and he's come here to bring us out of slavery, just as Moses did that with his own brothers, his fellow Hebrews. Another point I want to make known to you this morning is the importance of women. More critics say, oh yeah, the Judeo-Christian code is evil, it hates women and what. Hardly. Here we see the importance of Moses' mother and his sister. Here we see the importance of Pharaoh's daughter. It's not Pharaoh's son, it's Pharaoh's daughter. And when we look at the Christ, when we look at Jesus, we see the importance of women in his life as well. His mother, the women that accompanied him, the women who were there at the base of the cross. It wasn't his disciples, they fled, but the women are there at the base of the cross. So anybody who says that it is unequal, it's a patriarchal religion or whatnot. They're wrong. They have it totally wrong. The other point is redemption, the importance of water in redemption. How were these Hebrew children to be killed? These boys were to be thrown into the river and drowned. The Nile was their death, the source of death. And yet it is the river that saves Moses. Instead of being drowned, he's floated there and the water saves him. And he's put in a little basket, or this word I said means ark. Think of another ark, the earlier ark. Noah. Water comes and it wipes away the evil society, civilization that was here on earth. But the water saves Noah and his family, just as the water saves Moses. And this is important to remember. And even today in Christian faith, water is important. And Peter points this out. 1 Peter 3, familiar passage, starting verse 20. In the former times, these people did not obey, but God waited patiently in the days of Noah during the building of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were saved through water. And baptism, which this prefigured, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers made subject to him. So the water saved Noah and his family, just a few. The water saved Moses. He was one of the few. There were others who didn't make it. They were drowned in that river. And later on, we will see the importance of water when Moses leads them through the Red Sea. They make it through. Pharaoh's army is destroyed. The Jordan River, which later dries up and they can walk across and then it reflows again. Jonah, who he's thrown into the sea, and that saved the life of the men on the ship who were trying to save the vessel. John the Baptist returns later to the Jordan River, which had stopped so that the Israelites could cross into the land. So we see this repeated theme or motif of water saving. And finally, it comes to us, the true believers in Christ. Water saves. It's not the water itself that washes us, but it's our conscience. But still, we need that water, and it is important for salvation. So where is the hope here in the birth of this young child who's floating in the river? Well, in the midst of suffering, the oppression, the slavery of the Hebrew people, and the seeing of their young boys being drowned, in the midst of that suffering, when the situation seems hopeless, God is working. Herod comes in and has those innocents, as we call them, slaughtered in Bethlehem, but God is working. Situation might seem hopeless, but it is not when we trust and have faith in him, because he will be there with us. And of course, at the end, we see Jesus hanging on the cross. What a hopeless situation. Despair just overwhelms his disciples. It's over and done with. But we know that that was not the end of him. Resurrection comes to him. He's restored. He comes back. And nobody could have anticipated that or expected that. And the parents of Moses did not expect what was going to happen. They were just looking at their baby, want to save his life. They didn't realize that he was going to save their entire nation. And so even when things look bad, when things look bleak, we have this promise that God will be with us. He will be working for us and even through us. So I leave the lesson with you this morning. Powerful to children and powerful to even adults. Thank you.